To the casual observer sitting in the opulent coffee houses of Vienna or Paris at the turn of the century, the Balkan Peninsula was merely a rugged, backward hinterland of goat herders and ancient, impenetrable blood feuds. Yet beneath this mountainous topography lay a geopolitical fault line so volatile that its tremors would soon shatter the empires of the world. It was here, in the shadow of the Dinaric Alps, that the tectonic plates of three fading empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the Ottoman, ground against one another with screeching friction. The Ottoman Empire, long derided as the sick man of Europe, was receding, leaving behind a power vacuum that sucked in the ambitions of nascent ethno-states. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro were not merely seeking independence, they were resurrecting medieval dreams of empire, fueled by a romantic nationalism that viewed compromise as treason. In the chancelleries of the great powers, diplomats drew arbitrary lines on maps, ignoring the complex tapestry of religions and ethnicities on the ground. They treated the Balkans as a chessboard for their own strategic games, blissfully unaware that the pawns were arming themselves with modern rifles and ancient hatreds, preparing to overturn the board entirely.
The spark that would eventually ignite the world was struck not in 1914, but in the bloody pre-dawn hours of 1903. Serbia was then ruled by the Obrenović dynasty, a house that had tied its fortunes to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, effectively reducing the proud nation to an Austrian satellite. This subservience enraged the fiercely nationalist officer corps. On a dark June night, a conspiracy of officers led by the ruthless Dragutin Dmitrievich, known as Apis, stormed the royal palace in Belgrade. In an act of savagery that shocked the sensibilities of civilized Europe, they hunted down King Alexander and Queen Draga, murdering them in their chambers and hurling their mutilated bodies from the palace windows into the garden manure below. This regicide was a pivot point in history. The pro-Austrian Obrenović line was extinguished, replaced by the Karađorđević dynasty, which immediately pivoted Serbia's allegiance toward Russia and France. Vienna watched in horror as their vassal state transformed overnight into a hostile, Russian-backed threat on their southern border. The bloodshed in the royal garden signaled that the era of diplomatic niceties was ending. The era of the gun had begun.
Austria-Hungary, stung by the loss of influence in Belgrade, decided to strangle the rebellious Serbian kingdom economically. In 1906, Vienna launched what history whimsically calls the Pig War, closing its borders to Serbian pork, the country's primary export. It was a calculated attempt to bankrupt the peasantry and force the Serbian government to its knees. But the Habsburg bureaucrats had severely underestimated the resilience of Serbian nationalism and the cunning of its new leadership. Instead of capitulating, Serbia found new markets. They routed their goods through Salonika to France and Russia. They secured German investment to build canning factories, turning raw pork into a shelf-stable product that didn't require Austrian railways. The sanctions backfired spectacularly. Not only did the Serbian economy survive, it diversified and grew stronger, reducing its dependence on the dual monarchy. The Pig War demonstrated to the world that the Habsburg Empire was losing its grip. It was a humiliation for Vienna, fostering a dangerous sentiment among the Austrian general staff that economic pressure was useless and that only a military solution, a preventative war, could solve the Serbian problem once and for all.
If the Pig War was a tremor, the events of 1908 were the earthquake. The Young Turk Revolution in Constantinople threw the Ottoman Empire into chaos, and Austria's foreign minister, Count Alois von Aehrenthal, seized the moment. He unilaterally announced the formal annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, provinces Austria had administered but not owned since 1878. The move was a direct violation of international treaties and a slap in the face to Serbia, which viewed Bosnia as its rightful national heritage. Belgrade erupted in fury, crowds burned Austrian flags, and the army mobilized. Russia, Serbia's protector, moved to support them. War seemed inevitable. But then came the shining armor. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany stood firmly behind Austria, issuing a thinly veiled ultimatum to Russia: accept the annexation or face war against both Germanic empires. Russia, still battered from its defeat by Japan in 1905, was forced to back down. It was a profound diplomatic humiliation for the Tsar and a bitter lesson for Serbia. They learned that international law was a fiction. Only blood and iron determined the fate of nations.
By 1912, the weakness of the Ottoman Empire was undeniable. Italy had easily wrestled Libya from Turkish control, exposing the Sultan's military impotence. Sensing blood in the water, the Balkan states achieved the impossible. They set aside their mutual jealousies to form the Balkan League. Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro bound themselves in a secret alliance, united by a singular, voracious goal: to drive the Turk out of Europe forever. It was a marriage of convenience, fraught with distrust, but for the moment, the cross united against the crescent. In October 1912, defying the warnings of the great powers to maintain the status quo, the League struck. The declaration of war was met with jubilation in the capitals of the Balkans. Church bells rang in Athens, Belgrade, and Sofia, drowning out the frantic diplomatic cables from London and Berlin. The armies marched not just to conquer land, but to reclaim history, marching over the bones of ancestors who had fallen under Ottoman scimitars 5 centuries prior. The powder keg had finally exploded, and the shockwave would be far greater than anyone anticipated.
The First Balkan War was a blitzkrieg before the term existed. The Ottoman forces, plagued by poor logistics and low morale, collapsed under the coordinated assault. The Bulgarians drove toward Constantinople, their artillery thundering at the gates of the capital. The Serbs swept through Macedonia, avenging the Battle of Kosovo after 500 years. The Greeks seized Salonika mere hours before the Bulgarians arrived, a race for spoils that sowed the seeds of the next conflict. It was a humanitarian catastrophe of biblical proportions. Columns of Muslim refugees, stretching for miles, trudged through mud and snow, fleeing the vengeance of the Christian armies. In London, the great powers looked on, stunned. The sick man had not just died, he had been dismembered. The map of Europe was redrawn in weeks. But as the Ottoman tide receded, it revealed the jagged rocks of inter-allied rivalry. The victors stood over the carcass of Ottoman Europe, not as brothers, but as wolves eyeing the same piece of meat. The victory was total, but the peace was already poisoned.
The Treaty of London in 1913 was meant to bring peace, but it merely reset the board for a deadlier game. The crux of the problem was Macedonia, a prize coveted by Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece alike. Bulgaria, which had done the heavy fighting against the main Ottoman army, felt cheated when Serbia and Greece occupied the lion's share of the territory. Austria-Hungary, desperate to deny Serbia access to the sea, insisted on the creation of an independent Albania, further squeezing Belgrade and forcing the Serbs to hold on to Macedonian land they had promised to Bulgaria. The atmosphere was toxic. Former allies began digging trenches facing each other. The Russian Tsar pleaded for unity, but the heady wine of nationalism had intoxicated the Balkan kings. On June 29, 1913, only a month after the peace treaty, Bulgarian General Savov ordered an attack on his Serbian and Greek allies. It was a suicidal gamble. The Second Balkan War began not as a crusade against an occupier, but as a fratricidal slaughter among neighbors, a grim preview of the senseless attrition that would soon consume the entire continent.
Bulgaria's gamble was a catastrophe, attacked from all sides, by Serbia and Greece from the west and south, by the opportunistic Romanians from the north, and even by the vengeful Ottomans from the east. Bulgaria collapsed within weeks. The Treaty of Bucharest stripped Sofia of its gains, leaving a legacy of bitterness that would drive Bulgaria into the arms of Germany in the coming World War. But the true winner and the true danger was Serbia. The kingdom had doubled in size and population. It was now the dominant power in the Balkans, flush with victory and hardened by war. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. The Serbian army was exhausted, its treasury empty, its new territories restive. More ominously, the civilian government of Prime Minister Nikola Pašić was losing control to the military shadow state. The officers who had murdered a king in 1903 were now national heroes, convinced that force was the only language the world understood.
They turned their gaze west, across the Drina River, toward the millions of Serbs living under Habsburg rule. The Piedmont of the South Slavs was ready to complete its unification, regardless of the consequences.
In the dark recesses of Belgrade's cafes and barracks, a sinister organization festered, the Black Hand. Officially named Unification or Death, this secret society was led by the regicide himself, Apis. It functioned as a state within a state, answerable to no one, terrorizing its own government as much as its enemies. Apis believed that Serbia's destiny could only be achieved through violence and assassination. His tentacles reached deep into Bosnia, where a generation of young students, the Young Bosnians, chafed under Austrian rule. They read Nietzsche and Kropotkin, dreaming of martyrdom for the Slavic cause. The Black Hand provided them with the means to realize those dark dreams. In shadowy meetings, pistols were passed, cyanide vials distributed, and targets selected. They were amateurs, idealists, and fanatics, guided by a master manipulator who saw them as expendable ammunition. While the politicians in Vienna and Belgrade debated diplomacy, Apis was preparing a violent stroke that would cut the Gordian knot of Balkan politics. The weapon was primed. He only needed a target.
In Vienna, the mood was equally grim. The chief of the general staff, Count Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, was a man possessed by the idea of inevitable war. He had proposed attacking Serbia no fewer than 25 times in 1913 alone. To Conrad, the multi-ethnic empire was decomposing, eaten from within by Slavic nationalism and encircled from without by the Triple Entente. He argued that waiting was suicide. Better to strike now, while Russia was still rebuilding its army, than to wait for the slow death of the monarchy. The old emperor, Franz Joseph, was the primary brake on Conrad's aggression, a weary relic of the 19th century who dreaded a new conflict. But the war party was gaining strength. They viewed Serbia not as a sovereign state, but as a bandit nest that needed to be burned out. The rhetoric in the Viennese press grew hysterical, dehumanizing the Serbs and preparing the public for violence. The empire felt it was fighting for its very existence, a dangerous mindset that turned every diplomatic dispute into an existential crisis. They were looking for a pretext, a reason to unleash the legions.
Then came the fatal decision. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Habsburg throne, announced his intention to visit Sarajevo to inspect the army maneuvers. It was a visit born of hubris and terrible timing. The date chosen was June 28th, Vidovdan, St. Vitus Day. To the Serbs, this was the most sacred day in their calendar, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a day of mourning and national pride. For the Austrian heir to parade through the Bosnian capital on this specific day was seen as an unforgivable provocation, a conqueror dancing on the graves of the conquered. Warnings were sent. The Serbian ambassador in Vienna hinted at danger. Even Austrian officials advised against it. But Franz Ferdinand was stubborn. He wanted to show his beloved wife, Sophie, the honors she was denied in Vienna due to her lower royal status. In Sarajevo, she would be treated as an empress. Driven by love and imperial duty, he ignored the omens. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the date was circled in blood. The Archduke boarded his train, steaming towards a destiny that would consume millions. Sunday morning, June 28, 1914, Sarajevo was bathed in sunshine. The crowds lined the Apple Quay along the Miljacka River, a mixture of curious onlookers and silent conspirators. 7 young assassins were scattered along the route, weapons concealed under their coats, hearts pounding with adrenaline and terror. The motorcade approached. The first assassin froze. The second threw a bomb that bounced off the Archduke's folded roof and exploded under the following car. Chaos ensued, but incredibly, the visit continued. Franz Ferdinand, shaken but furious, insisted on visiting the wounded in the hospital. It was a decision that required the driver to take a wrong turn,
a simple navigational error that brought the open-topped Graf-and-Stift limousine to a halt exactly in front of a delicatessen where 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip was standing. Time seemed to stop. The eyes of the assassin met the eyes of the Archduke. In that frozen microsecond, the 19th century ended and the 20th began. Princip raised his pistol. 2 shots rang out, one for the tyrant, one for the wife. The powder keg had exploded. The world was at war.